Bible study with Dr. Tom Haney on October 11, 2022. Tonight we continue our 10-week Bible study titled Unlocking the Signs and Symbols of the Bible. Tonight's lesson is the fifth lesson of the series, and it's titled, Who Are the End Time Villains? Look at the Prophecies. Thanks for joining us tonight, both on Zoom and YouTube, as we continue our study series. There are two parts to our meeting, teaching and prayer time. Prayer time follows teaching and is optional, but available to those who have prayer needs. The study portion will be recorded and posted on YouTube on Thursday. Please check out the updated Hope Looks Up website at hopelooksup.org for Bible study schedules, previous study resources, and new inspiration tab where Tom posts words of inspiration every couple of weeks. We will begin with a word of prayer followed by Dr. Tom Haney. Dear Lord, it's exciting to be learning so much good information from this study series. With your guidance, Pastor Tom continues to present invaluable biblical knowledge, and we are lucky to be a part of the Hope Looks Up ministry. Bless all those who are in attendance and all those who later join on YouTube. Guide us as we continue to study, and may we apply all that we learn to better our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. Tom?
Well, thank you, Chuck, and it's a pleasure to greet each one of you tonight. You know, sometimes in a series, you just get really excited about one or two lessons, a little more excited than maybe some of the others. And tonight's one of those, because I feel like the Bible is probably not as difficult to understand in some of these areas of who are the end time villains and how does that live itself out if we follow the signs and the symbols that are there. God describes through the signs and symbols the nature, the evilness, the allegiances of these villains by taking traits from the enemies of Israel and the enemies of the church and explaining what we should know about them. We're going to make one little change tonight, and that is, please feel free to put your questions up, but we're going to close our session for the YouTube, and then I will answer the questions where we can have some back and forth exchange if there's any discussion that you want to have. We'll do that right before we go into prayer time. We won't spend very long with that at all. The Bible uses a series of signs and symbols to talk about these end time villains. It's interesting. World powers, those are the two prominent. Babylon and Rome are actually the two most prominent. Cities, kings, and then even insects, reptiles, and animals to describe these evil characters. In addition to their spiritual names, Satan, the Antichrist, and the spiritual beast, we will reference them in this study tonight as Satan, the Antichrist, and then the one world church leader, a partner of the Antichrist who kind of switches sides midway through Revelation and becomes sort of the henchman for the Antichrist. We'll study the most common 8 signs and symbols about the end time villains. No reference is more frequent than the references to Babylon. When Satan attempts to build a visible kingdom on earth, the Bible tells us he will call that city Babylon. It's a city that is a culmination of evil because it will oppose God at every possible direction. We first hear about Babylon in Genesis, the 11th chapter. It's a place where the people decided to build a tower, declare themselves godlike. If you'll remember, some of the main characters of Babylon at that point were Nimrod, who was its leader, and Nimrod's mother, Easter, from which we get our word for Easter. It's a city that the results of this was that it divided the world into languages, and it also failed for the people to become gods as they had hoped to be. But the city of Babylon was not held back by that. In fact, the city and the area around it continued to prosper and grow, and it became the first world power, as historians called it. Historically, Babylon was affected and interacted with Israel to a strong extent when Israel was still a nation of 12 tribes. In fact, 2nd Chronicles and 2nd Kings are full of references to Israel, Babylon, Jerusalem. Each of the major prophets of the Old Testament, Ezekiel, Daniel, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, all mention Babylon quite a few times. And it's in Isaiah that we find what's going to happen when Babylon falls. It's in Ezekiel that we find that what is going to happen when, as Babylon is put more into a historical perspective, when the temple is rebuilt, etc. And it's in the book of Daniel that we actually find that Daniel uses both of these kingdoms. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we go and look at the area of Rome. Jeremiah, as the weeping prophet, mostly uses Babylon to talk about the terrible things that will happen to Israel and to Jerusalem. But you cannot read the Old Testament without seeing what an important role Babylon played in the life of the Hebrews and their nation. The symbolic use of Babylon was based on interaction facts between Israel and Babylon. Now, that's very important because that's one of the keys I want us to see as we look at these signs and symbols tonight. Mostly in the New Testament, it is only the symbolic use of Babylon. The only exception is in the book of Matthew, where the genealogy of Jesus is traced through the exiles from the Babylon exile and shows that God's will was not thwarted, going from King David to King Jesus by simply because Babylon had overthrown Israel. The rest of the New Testament speaks most often of Babylon as a wicked and powerful city, rather than references to the ancient city or the ancient area of Iran, Iraq. Babylon had long disappeared from the scene of being a world power by the time of Christ. And so the new Babylon for the early Christians was the nation of Rome. Like Babylon, Rome was also a city of wealth and importance, as well as a world power. Rome oppressed the nation of Israel, mostly the nation of Judah. There was no Israel at that point. Under Pontius Pilate, they sentenced Jesus Christ to death. They persecuted all Christians over the major cities of the Bible. And so Peter writes to the oppressed, persecuted Jewish Christians in 1 Peter 5:13, and he says, "Your sister church in Babylon," standing for Rome, "chosen by God, and my son Mark greet you." Babylon is mentioned 6 times in Revelation. Chapter 14, chapter 16, 17, 18, 3 times in 18. Some believe that the ancient city of Babylon will be rebuilt and will play this vital role in the end times. But I believe it's almost like what I said last week of God not reincarnating Elijah to get John the Baptist. God just uses John the Baptist, who has many similar traits as Elijah, to be a forerunner like Elijah was. I think Babylon here is used primarily as this ancient city of power that persecuted God's people. It's a symbol named for a city of evil people who did evil things, holding anti-Christian beliefs, and having the desire to oppose God in every way. Babylon was known for its gods, and like the Romans, it worshipped hundreds of gods. Babylon's main god was the sun god, but it had hundreds of gods that it worshipped, much like the Egyptians as well. Let's look at the things said about this city in Revelation. It's not only a city that opposes God, but it's a city that is full of every kind of abuse and power. The arrogance of opposing God meets its logical end when they begin to kill people, murder the martyrs, as we see in the book of Revelation, when they exploit the weak, the widows, the orphans, and so on, and every imaginable type of debauchery. Revelation 17, 5 and 6 paints a terrible picture of the city. It says the name written on this woman's head, meaning the city that was the oppressing power against the Christians, was a mystery. Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who had testimony to Jesus. So Babylon, like Rome and like many other cities, was known for its destruction of Christians. In fact, almost all of the people fed to the lions by the Romans in their great circuses were Christians. It was and that was true in Babylon as well. There was a lot of persecution of Christians. Babylon represents the multitude of humanity that insists on making its last stand against God in the book of Revelation. God rescues those who belong to him, and in the final scenes of Revelation, show Babylon in total collapse and being destroyed. Before the final destruction and description of that destruction in Revelation 18, John writes these words: when the kings of the earth who committed adultery with her, and that could have been a series of alliances, trade, it could have been a host of different ways in which they did that, shared her luxury, see the smoke of her burning, they'll weep and mourn over her. Terrified at her torment, many will stand far off and cry and say, woe, woe to you, great city, you mighty city of Babylon. In 1 hour, your doom has come. That leads us to the city of Rome and the symbol and sign that was there in the New Testament. The first time we actually hear of Rome in the Bible, it's a portion of that great prophecy of Daniel after he has been given a dream by Nebuchadnezzar about 4 world powers. Actually, it's a great warrior with gold and silver and bronze and then iron mixed with clay as far as the base of this man. He says that the first one represents Babylon, which is at that time. The second, the Medes and Persians, which we know history tells us conquered Babylon. And then he talks about 2 powers that weren't powers at that time at all. First of all was the Greeks, kind of a small tribe of people down on the bottom part of Greece, did not even include Macedonia at that time. It was just the bottom area below the isthmus. And Rome, which was primarily a city in the middle of Italy, which was not very developed. But Daniel prophesied those 4 would be the world powers: Babylon, Medes and Persians, Greeks, and then the Romans. And by the time of the New Testament, it had come true. The Greeks had already been conquered by the Romans, and the Romans had conquered much of the world, including Judah. And they controlled the area where Christ lived his entire ministry, as well as the start of the church. They controlled that area as well. In fact, the taxation of Judah by Rome was the very means that God used to get Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem for the birth of their son, Jesus Christ. Rome served as a tool for God to use to accomplish his will. A Roman leader, Pontius Pilate, basically signed the death certificate to have Jesus Christ killed when he said to the people, do as you want to do, and in so doing created the one true sacrifice for all of our sins. It was the Romans' government desire to control everything that allowed Paul to be taken to Rome as a prisoner and spread the gospel even to the palaces of Rome. But again, in the book of Revelation, where the symbol of Rome is on display for the church and future believers, by the time Revelation was written, official persecutions were being carried out under the authority of the Roman Empire. Christianity was being outlawed in many places by the Romans, ironically, because it was considered atheistic. It would not accept and follow the Roman practice of emperor worship. Therefore, since they only worshiped Jesus, they were atheists. They didn't worship the true gods, the Caesars of Rome. But once again, we see that Revelation seems to reveal much more than simply a veiled picture of conditions and enduring, encouraging prophecy regarding the eventual fall of Rome. It taught a pattern for the first century Christians how they could exist in a world led by Rome, which has become the pattern for oppressed believers to courageously keep the faith in face of strong opposition from ruthless pagan governments, including today. The Sudan, Pakistan, several other nations, Christians are certainly living a very difficult and very terrible life. It taught a pattern for how the first century Christians could exist in such a world. Rome was a symbol of a nation that never intended to bring true justice to the people that it controlled, but just to protect itself from threats without and within. It's easy to see why such a symbol has and always will produce resentment among people. We need to look at one last city symbol used in the Bible to point out end-time villains. It doesn't have the same prominence as Babylon and Rome. It's not mentioned as many times in Revelation. In fact, it's only mentioned twice in Revelation, but it's the city Sodom. Sodom is used in the Bible as a symbol for sin and the judgment that comes from God upon sin. It did reference the sexual sins of the city and especially the passage in Jude. But most of the passages in the New Testament which use Sodom as a symbol or a sign use it to warn the people about not living a godly life. Romans 9:29, for instance, says, "It is just as Isaiah said previously, unless the Lord Almighty had left us descendants, we would have become like Sodom. We would have become like Gomorrah," a warning to ungodly, unrepentant people. 2 Peter 2:6 warns the same. Do not become like Sodom. John describes Sodom as a symbol in Revelation and says this when he's talking about the two witnesses that come to Jerusalem to evangelize and win people in the last times. They're killed and left to lie in the city. Here's what John writes: their bodies will be in the public square of that great city. He's talking about Jerusalem, but here's what he says, which is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt. In other words, places that either were sinful or worshiped a host of gods, where also their Lord was crucified. The tragedy of Sodom lies buried in history, but the lessons of Sodom continue with us every day. The day of the Lord will bring this total and irrevocable judgment of God, epitomized by Sodom. Of all the end time signs and symbols, probably the most confusing and the one that I've certainly had people question the most and come up with ideas with me in discussion is the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord has created many different interpretations of what that day of the Lord really is. That's because I think we look at the day of the Lord through English eyes. A day to us is 24 hours. So there's a day like today was a holiday, Columbus and Indigenous Day. We will have a day on Christmas, December 25th, called Christmas. We'll have a day on January 1st called New Year's. But that's not how the Hebrews, especially, nor even the New Testament Jews, used the word day. The word day was many times used to symbolic for times or even years. So the Hebrew language often used day to explain age. 1 Chronicles 23:1 speaks of a person who lived a long time, says they were full of days. So it wasn't a 24-hour period. It was, they just had this long life. Or Psalm 21, chapter 20th Psalm, verse 1, says days of trouble, speaking about a whole host of times. Day was also used by our Lord Jesus Christ as a symbol of how we were to live. We were to do what was good and right. In that sense, it was contrasted with night and dark. Christians were to be a light of the day. We were to let our lights shine. We were to live in the daylight, in the openness of what it really means to live for the Lord. The most common use of the phrase last days means the time before the second coming of Jesus Christ, Hebrews 1:2. This book, written in the first century, calls even the days in the writing of the book the last days. Let's take a closer look at the phrase then, the day of the Lord. The phrase is used to describe what only God can do and highlights the control that God has over all events. Some have occurred, some will occur, and some will happen only on the last specific 24-hour day. Joel 1:8 and Amos 5:18 through 20, which we're going to look at in a moment, tell us that can be even for a multitude of things. It can happen for an event that happened then that was part of the day of the Lord, and it can also be prophetic of something that's going to happen in the very end times, the very last few days of life itself. It is used as God's intervention into the affairs of the earth, Lamentations 2:22. But the most frequent and perhaps confusing symbol is when it's used by the prophets to tell of an event in their time, and then also to tell of an event in the very end times. Let's look at Isaiah 13:5 through 10, and I would have written this out for you, but I thought it seemed a little long. In this prophecy, Isaiah tells of a time where the Babylonian nation will fall, and it did. It fell. The Medes and the Persians entered Babylonia through their wonderful hanging gardens and came through the viaducts and entered the palace and captured the people. But Jesus in Mark 13:24 through 37 takes the very same passage from Isaiah and paints a picture of the final days of the Lord, the end of human history, when the symbolic Babylon is destroyed by God in the final events of what later is called Armageddon. We find the same thing when Peter's preaching on the day of Pentecost. And Peter, in the preaching on the day of Pentecost, quotes a passage out of Joel. It's Joel 2:31, where he talks about the terrifying days of the Lord, which are later picked up in the book of Revelation to talk about the end times. But Peter says, you're seeing this fulfilled today. Your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall have visions. Your young daughters shall speak in languages and so on. He's saying it's already being revealed right then. So here's the confusing part, I think, to us as people who speak English, and that is that we see that the day of the Lord represents years and centuries that only come to a close when God reveals his final day. The day of the Lord has many prophetic references to Jesus. He has fulfilled all that he came to accomplish. For many, the day of the Lord will be an anticipation of reward, not a day of judgment. That's one of the things that I want us to sense when we see these end time villains. We need to realize that God is not going to make them quite as difficult to figure out as we think they are. And we've all sat in on discussions where people have said, well, I think the Antichrist is this person or that person, or this political figure or that political figure, or, this leader in Europe or this leader in Jordan or whoever. But I think what I want us to see is simply this. It's a day when the guilty and the innocent will be defined by God. Now, that's a very common teaching in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians 1:8, 5 through 2, 2 Corinthians 1:14, Philippians 1:10, Philippians 2:16 tells us that this end time, this end judgment, will be a time where God sorts out the guilty and the innocent. Jesus told several parables about it himself. The parable of the tares, the parable of the sheep and the goats. Several of Jesus' parables talked about the fact that the final culmination of the day of the Lord, controlled by Jesus, will be a time where the guilty are put into one section, the innocents are reserved for all of their rewards. Well, interestingly enough, the Bible also uses the symbol of insects to speak about end time villains. The locust. The locust is a description of an end time villain. It's in the book of Joel 2:3 through 5. It's also in the book of Revelation, when these locust-like creatures come and appear as the Euphrates River is dried up. But let's look at some things about it. At a day and an age when none of modern military arms were there, the locust probably represented a ravaging army better than almost anything else. For a locust, it says in Joel 2, would overcome a hill, it would be barren. Would overcome a next hill, it would be barren. Would continue until they had everything destroyed. In its judgment, some are given human faces, noting the characteristic of the locust, but knowing who the person is. They were also given lions' teeth to show their villains will be people of great destruction. They were given armor like protection, so it would show their invincibility and their ability to have either tanks, body armor, a host of different ways in which they are protecting themselves. And they would be given scorpion-like stingers to show their willingness to use lethal and perhaps even nuclear weapons. Becomes a lot more visible to us today, doesn't it, when we begin to see a world leader openly speak about using tactical nuclear weapons to accomplish his purpose. And then people begin to talk about, well, whether NATO would be involved or not might be the way the wind is drifting. if a tactical nuclear weapon strikes part of Ukraine and it goes on into Europe. Today, we can read this passage as an almost literal description of what the Battle of Armageddon might be like in Joel 2, where the description of just this destruction as these armies from the east and the armies that have gathered together to oppose Christ make their way to the hills of Mount Hebron, to the heights of Syria. And there, I think we need to see something else. In the middle of this passage, God holds out a passage of great hope. Joel 2:25. I think sometimes when we look at end-day times villains, we're so focused on how awful they are that we forget that God throws in things where he says, I'm also taking care of you. There is one great passage of hope in the symbol of the locust. It's in Joel 2:25. God writes, I will restore to you the years the locusts have eaten. In other words, your crops may have been destroyed in some of these years, but I will double your crop. I will bring this bountiful reward to you. It's a theme of the end times. God will protect his own while the rest of mankind is destroyed. And you say, well, if they're martyrs, how are they protected? Just read Revelation and see the heroes welcome the martyrs get. See how God is going to give them a prominent place in the millennial kingdom. See how they are going to be lifted up and exalted and seen as great heroes all the way of eternity. It's the next few symbols that lead us to know the most about end time villains. And this is where I want us to begin to kind of get our thinking hats on as we listen. They're called beasts. They're not just any beast, but beasts that are under the guidance and tutelage of Satan. They will end up being possessed by Satan. In biblical language, the primary beast of Revelation is the Antichrist. 1 John 2:18 and 19 defines the fact that there actually be many Antichrists. Anybody opposing Jesus is an Antichrist, including some who actually began in the church. But one special Antichrist will gain power over all the physical earth. He's introduced as a beast from the sea, Revelation 13:1. Now that's very interesting because nowhere else is anyone ever called that distinction. Everybody else is either a beast from the land, or they're people born of nature, or they have a regular genealogy. And so what does he say? Well, John defines that in Revelation 13. It is a complete mockery of the creation of God. Remember that in Genesis, God created man in the image of God. The Antichrist appears to be made in the image of the dragon or the serpent or Satan. Doesn't mean that he's going to be scary with fire breathing out of his mouth. It doesn't mean that he's going to wither and slither all over the ground. It doesn't mean that he's going to have a pitchfork or a tail or horns or any of the other crazy things that people have put together with some of these ideas of who Satan is and their interpretations. But it does mean that he will have all the traits. Satan is devious. Satan is a deceiver. Satan is a pretender. Satan is a person opposed to God at every level. And specifically, the Antichrist will have all of those traits. He'll be worshipped by many, Revelation 13:3 and 4 says. And he is a symbol of all that is opposed to God. Specifically, he will be an evil leader and use his authority to demolish and destroy anything that resembles Christian virtues or godly actions. He'll be given by the devil, it says in Revelation 13:2b, 3 great things. He'll be given power. So you say, well, what power does the devil have? Well, remember when the devil took Jesus up into the mountains and he said, if you'll fall down and worship me, I'll give you all of these lands that you see. How could he give him those lands? He could give him those lands because the people controlling them were atheistic, or they were animistic, or they were idolaters, or they had false religion. He will give him kingdoms. Everyone that is anti-God is pro-Satan, and Satan has control and influence over those kingdoms. He will give him far-reaching authority. In other words, even to areas that the Antichrist has never had any connection or any dealings with. His power will be unrivaled in the annals of history because he will have constant supernatural demonic control. He will control the known world, all of that he wants to control. I hope this moves your thinking away from deciding which American president or secretary of state or leader of the United Nations is the Antichrist until they start killing Christians and become atheistic and try to take over parts of the world that are atheistic. We need to recognize that probably there aren't going to be many Americans who line up as this potential Antichrist. The second beast is also described in Revelation. He has a much more mundane appearance and comes from the land. In other words, he's grown up just as each of us has, but he will function as an enforcer for the Antichrist or the first beast. We know him as the one world leader or the prophet, the false prophet is what he's called early in Revelation. But Revelation 13:11 through 14 tells us that there will come a time when his kingdom is destroyed. The church, this one world church, will become attacked by its enemies. It says for its wealth, it's all the things that it has. And at that point, he will actually join forces with the Antichrist to be the enforcer. In fact, Revelation tells us that he will be the one who sets up the animated figure of the Antichrist in the temple and forces people either to worship it or to be killed. They will form an unholy trinity with Satan. And interestingly enough, the Antichrist and this beast or false prophet or one world church leader will be the first occupants in the lake of fire. They will be the primarily agents leading this rebellion of Satan against God. Satan has many symbols or names in the Bible, each chosen to point out the destruction that he can bring. He was first called the serpent, symbolic of the sinister deception first revealed in the Garden of Eden, and then traced throughout the history of mankind. He was given the name also of a symbol of a dragon. And in the Greek, it is drakon, D-R-A-K-O-N, which interestingly enough was a word beast before the English word dragon was formed out of it. It's used 12 times in Revelation. It's not used in the rest of the scripture. We might wonder why a new villainous name comes at this point of the Bible. Why is he moved from a sinister, devious snake to an all-consuming, destroying dragon? Revelation 12:7-5, I think, holds the key. It says in Revelation 12:5-7 that Satan was expelled from heaven. Now, because we're limited again in our English to believe that heaven is just the place where God is, we need to realize that the Jewish people believed in three heavens. There was this heaven around us, this earth that we see as our atmosphere. We can see it with the naked eye. There were heavens that were beyond that. In the day and age of the Bible, they were primarily the planets and the stars that you could see here on Earth. Today, with our telescopes and so on, we see that it's a vast, unbelievable universe. And then there was the third heaven, which was wherever God was. And we know from Isaiah that at one point, Satan actually existed in that third heaven. As named Lucifer, he lived in the same area as God. But he entered a battle with Michael. And Michael and the angels were sufficiently superior to Satan and his angels that they cast him out of heaven, clearly from all three heavens. He didn't end up in the universe, the galaxies, nor did he end up in the atmosphere. He ended up on the earth without a physical body. This dragon symbol became an image of what happens when Satan inhabits a person, the Antichrist, and controls all of the actions of the one he possesses. So we see some more clues on who this end-time villain will be. Will be a person who's demonic in their approach to life, will oppose anything that even appears to show goodness, will oppose anything that's kind, generous, good. You take the fruits of the Spirit, every one of those will be what this Antichrist, this dragon now possessed by Satan, will have. He will oppose anything that is positive in any manner. The Bible lists many villains, and we see some of the most sinister and depraved actions done by these. But within the Bible, it compares Satan to earthly kings. We only find two. Isaiah 14, the prophet speaks of the final destruction of the king of Babylon, and Jesus tells us in Luke 10:18 that is also speaks of the fall of Satan. Why would Isaiah use the king of Babylon and Satan in the same comparison? Well, it was a rebuke of the king and the devil who energized him. What were their traits? They had unbridled arrogance. They were full of pride, conceit, and deceit. They both wanted to be rulers over God's small g and God's big G. They opposed God in every way. They wanted to be the most powerful people in the universe. The second king that is linked in comparison with Satan is in Ezekiel 28:12-17, where Ezekiel compares the king of Tyre and Satan and intermeshes them in a prophecy. Some of the things are for the king of Tyre, some can only be speaking about Satan. Why the king of Tyre? He also desired to be a god and to be worshipped as a god. He was motivated and controlled by Satan. He and his country were skilled and talented, were considered the wealthiest, most beautiful, wisest, most perfect city of their time. And they, the Phoenicians, were the first world explorers. More clues on who this Antichrist will be and what he will look like. He will be skilled and surrounded by skilled and talented people. He will have great arrogance in his talent and in his entourage, because they will be the most talented people of the world. He will have an unquenchable desire for people to worship him, so unquenchable that he will destroy all of them who will not. He will not just want them to admire him or popularize him, but truly to worship him. Now you might say, okay, Pastor Tom, I understand, but you still seem like you're talking a little bit in riddles. I still don't know who the Antichrist is. I still don't know who this world prophet, this church leader is. I don't even know what this city of Babylon is. Well, I just read something recently by Pastor Joseph Kahn in his explanation of mysteries that I think will help us in this area. And that is, the Bible uses another symbol for the devil, Satan. He's called the wolf. He's not the only wolf. Jesus said that many false prophets will go out like wolves in sheep's garments. They'll enter the flock and try to destroy the flock. But it was a name synonymous with evil and synonymous with Satan and those who work for Satan. It became true for the Jewish people. The ultimate wolf for the Jewish people would have to be Adolf Hitler and his Nazi army. He hunted down Jewish people. He herded them together. He led them as sheep to be slaughtered in the ovens of the various places of the camps that he set up. He drove his followers to exterminate all Jews in every country that he controlled. Here's some things you may not know. The name of his military headquarters was Wolfschwanz. I may not be saying that right. I'm not probably a very good German speaker. Wolfschlucht. It's a German word for the wolf's gorge. And then he had Wolf's Quarter, excuse me. He had another military headquarters named Wolfschlucht, Wolfschlucht, or the Wolf's Gorge, and yet another called the Werewolf. He had his closest friends call him, guess what? The Wolf. And his name, Adolf, means the wolf. That is how real the villains of God's people are. And that is how real our Messiah is. If there's a flock and a wolf, there is also a shepherd. We really will not have to question when the villains of the end times appear. They will be as obvious to believers as the wolf was to German-speaking Jews. Every time they heard the name Adolf, it meant wolf. They had no trouble understanding that at all. We will know, because we've been taught by God, how these villains will act and what they will do to reveal themselves. Take care and be blessed. we're all in the hands of God Almighty. Let me turn it back over to you tonight, Chad.
Well, thank you, Tom, for another great message. Next week, Tom's lesson will be titled, "The Lord is in the Prophetic Details." I will be posting tonight's lesson on the Hope Looks Up YouTube site on Thursday, and the notes will be distributed on Sunday. For those that would like to participate, prayer time will begin now.